Hello and welcome to the Car Nerd Talks, where today I'm going to be talking about an incredible show that we all know and love, which is Top Gear and the Grand Tour. But mainly I'm going to be speaking about the three guys who made it and how it all came to be. This is a bit of a different episode, and if you tuned in to watch something about the XK120, I'm sorry, but that's going to be pushed back for about a week because I've got a ton of other videos to do. If you enjoy these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe to this pokey little motoring YouTube. I'd really appreciate it. But anyway, let's just jump straight into it. If you're watching this channel, then more than likely you enjoy either the Grand Tour or Top Gear or just the three guys in general, or you're a Drivetribe member, which is awesome because they founded that as well. The reason for saying that is all car lovers love this show because at one point this was the biggest show in the world with over 350 million viewers worldwide in 2015 for Top Gear. So this, to most of us motoring enthusiasts, is more important than the baby Jesus. So today we're going to talk about how the three wise men, Clarkson, Hammond and May, made it from their old lives working in radio, civil service and being bullied at school to going on to become three of the most famous people in the world in this special entitled Three Wise Men's Journey to the Desert.
News. What?
James May, of course, we all know and love. He is Captain Slow, and he was the last to join the trio back in 2003 on Top Gear. But how his life started was actually in the civil service. He was for a short time in the civil service, which is not that surprising. He seems like the type. But then in the 1980s, he started working in car motoring journalism. First of all, for a magazine called The Engineer, before moving over to Autocar. But famously, he was fired from Autocar in 1992 for doing something quite hilarious. So if anyone remembers those old magazines, you had what was called the initial, which is the first letter of the entire article would have a bigger letter, usually in a different color. In Autocar's case, it was a big red letter. And for the road test yearbook, he decided to have a bit of fun. So he managed to line up all of the articles while he was editor, so that if you read just the initials, as you'll see on screen in a moment, it would have said, "So you think this is good, yeah? Try making the bloody thing. It's a pain in the arse." Unfortunately, this got back to his bosses, who eventually fired him for this. However, he carried on in his motoring journalistic ways, and in 1999 he had his first appearance on a pokey little motoring show called Top Gear, which at the time wasn't the same format. This was old Top Gear, and he's seen amongst Tiff Nadell, etc., making a mafia style video where they have to steal a Jaguar for a bank job, and he later reviews that Jaguar S-Type. This was his first ever time on Top Gear, but it was the original, as I said. His first time on the new version of Top Gear, the more famous version alongside Clarkson and Hammond, was in 2003, which means he missed the first year, because in the first series, his role was taken by Jason Daw, who was replaced after a year, thankfully, and it brought all of them together. Captain Slow, I'm not sure why that's his nickname. They say it's for his driving style, but Clarkson says it's because he showed up a year late after getting lost on his way to Top Gear.
Hammond!
As for our little hamster, Richard Hammond, he began his life, in Harrogate College of Art and Design. I assume he had a childhood, but we're not going to go that far back. And this is why he is always hounded on the show for having an arts degree, because it's true, he has an arts degree from Harrogate. He then went on to a prestigious, a career in radio, going from Radio York, Cumbria, Newcastle, Leeds, and eventually ending up in Hell, or as they called it, Radio Lancashire. Fortunately for him, this would work out quite well because they had a weekly guest on, a friend of his called Zog Ziegler. And Zog Ziegler would review cars over the phone, and this was a weekly segment that would go on Radio Lancashire for a long time. So over the time, the two became very good friends, and eventually Zog Ziegler asked him why he didn't make money as a motoring journalist, because it was something that Hammond was very interested in. Of course, it would take another while for Hammond to get into this, but in the 90s, Hammond appeared on satellite TV. Remember that channel that used to show just cars and porn. Men and Motors, I think it was called. It was an incredible channel for us young lads, and that's where he made his start before eventually getting offered the job on the 2002 reinstallment of Top Gear that we all know and love today.
Clarkson! I know it's you, you insufferable oaf. I'm on the bloody throne.
You probably think Clarkson is a bit posh, and the reason for that is he kind of is, but his father was not an inheritance baby at all. His father and mother decided when he was around 13 to make replicas of Paddington bears in the house, and they had some good entrepreneurial skills already. They weren't doing poorly. But one day they got sued by the Paddington Bear Company owned by Michael Bond. And when Jeremy Clarkson's father went down to London to talk to them about this lawsuit, he happened upon Michael Bond in the elevator. The two didn't know who the other one was, as far as I'm aware, but they hit it off quite well. And Michael Bond ended up selling them the Paddington Bear licensing rights for a steal. So all of a sudden they came into all this money, and they were fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your outlook, able to put Jeremy Clarkson into the Repton School, which was a school for highly privileged rich young boys who would become the privileged upper class of London and of, well, all of England, I guess. So this is where Clarkson gets his kind of posh background from. However, Clarkson hated that school. He said he was bullied profusely. He was even made, according to himself, to lick the toilets clean one time, which doesn't sound fun for anyone, even Clarkson. Now, I'm sure he probably said something horribly offensive to cause this, but we can't be sure. After that, he said he generally created a nuisance, smoking, drinking, and just causing problems at the school, until he eventually got expelled, which he thinks is probably the best thing that happened to him. After this, he started a career in journalism, writing articles for a few different magazines. Actually, at one point he wrote an article for the Amstrad magazine, of all things. I'm glad he didn't get into computer reviews, or we wouldn't be talking about this today. But when he started at the Shropshire Star, they let him do a column about cars. He said it was great, and he worked his way from Minis up to Ford Granadas, and eventually, after a few years, he was allowed to drive an Aston Martin Lagonda. But he says it was 10 years before he got to drive the Lamborghini. Now, going back to the Repton School, the one good thing about that would now come in a little bit later was the fact that he met Andy Willman, who would go on to be an incredible producer, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. But he also met a lot of other fellow do-gooders along that school line, and one of those was Jason Barr. That's not important, he's not famous anymore, but he invited him to come and try out for the Top Gear series in 1988. What happened there was he went on, and the rest of them were quite conservative, normal car reviews, very magazine format, which is what the show was at the time. But the producers they absolutely loved Clarkson's offensive and funny line, and the completely different take he would have on all the cars. So he got the part on that show, and that is how Clarkson started his career as a real television motoring journalist from 1988 to 2000 on the original Top Gear. When Top Gear was cancelled in 2001, Clarkson and Andy Willman, his old schoolmate, decided to meet up and talk about how they wanted to create a new motoring show. They started pitching each other ideas on how they could do something a little bit different from the old magazine format that was the norm at the time on basically every channel. So they looked at different things they could do, like a live studio audience, as well as just changing things up, having a track, guests, all that kind of thing. So they put all this together in a package that would become the new Top Gear, and they brought it to the BBC. Now, fortunately for them, the BBC was looking for an all-new format. And the reason for this was that Channel 5 had recently aired the new show Fifth Gear with some of the old people like Tiff Needell from Top Gear, and they needed something to compete, so the timing could not have been better. So in 2002, they began production on the new series of Top Gear. But first of all, they had to look for a location. And that's where they found the Dunsfold Aerodrome, which would become the studio for the entire thing, right up to, well, now it's still in the same location. It was perfect because it had a track, it had the entire hangar that they could use as the actual studio, and it was in a top secret location, just off the B2130, I believe, at the Horsham Road. This is where it all began and where they created the show, of course with the three including Jason Dahl, who would be in the first series replacing May, and then May would join a year later in 2003. Little did they know this would become one of the biggest shows in the world. So if we look forward to how this show continued, we can see that it became a massive success, and the BBC tried to keep it on for as long as they could. Of course, this didn't work out quite well about 13 years later, but in the meantime, at the peak of its ratings height, it had 214 countries where it was being aired, 350 million viewers, and was pulling in £150 million for the BBC. So you can probably see why in 2015, when everything happened, it was quite a big deal for them to let Jeremy go, which I'll get into now. On the tracks of 2014, the BBC was already under a bit of pressure to get rid of Clarkson, and they didn't want to because, as I've already said, this was a massive cash cow for the company. But they kind of were getting to the point where they had to, because about a year earlier, in 2014, during an episode, a hot mic had caught Jeremy Clarkson picking between two cars using Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. Unfortunately, he had used the old version that, well, we knew when we were growing up as well, which had the N-word, unfortunately. So this didn't go down too well, and there was a lot of complaints over racism. Unfortunately, going on from that, during the Burma special, they were watching an Asian man crossing a bridge when Jeremy Clarkson said there's a slope on that bridge. This caused havoc and brought in more complaints about racism. And to make things even worse, in December of 2014, as you probably recall, the Patagonia special caused massive upheaval in Argentina and a massive, almost international incident, all down to a license plate that said H982FKL that the Argentinians thought was referencing the Falklands. So things were already on the brink for Clarkson with the BBC. They were kind of wondering, is there a point to keeping him around, or is it going to cause us more problems? The point to keeping him around was the money, but they were looking at fierce scrutiny from a lot of the viewing public. The unfortunate thing about this is the BBC is a government station, so you have to keep in mind that they're not under the normal regulations of another channel. Their commercial success comes from taxpayer money. Then, in the 10th of March 2015, during a production meeting, I believe it was, or a production dinner, Jeremy Clarkson and one of his producers got into a verbal disagreement, which ended up with Jeremy Clarkson pushing Timon, the producer, in the face. Fortunately, before this, Jeremy Clarkson had got away with punching someone else in the face, but the reason for that was it's Piers Morgan, and nobody cared because, well, it's Piers Morgan. However, this time they did care, and Jeremy Clarkson was immediately suspended while the BBC looked into it. And then on the 25th of March of the same year, he was terminated from the show. Quickly behind him left Andy Willman, who said he wouldn't produce the show if Clarkson wasn't there. And shortly after this, Hammond May decided on the same thing. So at this point, everybody had left, leaving the BBC with a no-show and having to create an entirely new format or show. And as you know, today they just have 3 new presenters doing essentially the same show. This wasn't the last Top Gear produced though. On the 28th of June 2015, they released another episode that had been recorded in the earlier months of the year, but for the studio segments it was only Hammond May and there was no studio audience. A little bit later in the same year, Clarkson had stated that he had lost his baby and he would create a brand new one. The rumour mill went nuts as people tried to figure out what the new show would be. And then more and more details were leaked as May and Hammond and Clarkson and Willman had started W. Chump and Sons Limited. And they had also begun constructing what is Drivetribe, which probably a lot of you are watching this. You've probably read the article about this on Drivetribe, where I am a writer, a creator, whatever you want to call me. So they started looking for a new place to host this show, and they couldn't do it in England because of a non-compete disclosure that Clarkson had with the BBC. So everybody knew it would have to be an American company. One of these was BT Sports, but they said they didn't have the global reach to do it. The other one was Netflix, and Netflix said that the money that they wanted was just too much for what they would get. So they looked to be out of luck on creating this, but fortunately for them, another pokey little startup run by a pokey little entrepreneur called Jeff Bezos and Amazon had started their own streaming service called Prime Video, and they were looking for a massive show to garner that wide audience they needed. And all of a sudden, things were go. The Grand Tour was produced, and they started working on this in July of 2015. And then on November 2016, the world was let in to the new show, Grand Tour, unveiled by the Holy Trinity driving into the desert. An incredible way to open the series, and it's gone on since then. So this year we're going to have one more special, I believe, the Madagascar special, some sort of coronavirus on, as Clarkson talked about recently. So not as many these days, but it still lives on, and I think we're all thankful to that. So thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow, where I'm going to be talking about some sort of Ferrari, I believe, and I'll have the XK120 Jaguar video up on the 23rd of May, so you can watch into that. And don't forget to check me out on Drivetribe. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. Talk to you soon. And on that bombshell, back to YouTube.